Hello everyone, this is Sorensen here, back for another video for Abnormal Psychology. This week we're going to be looking at character insanity plea, and we're going to be going over the different insanity defense rulings and the film character that we're going to be discussing. One film I viewed was extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile, in part because it goes over the actual trials of Ted Bundy, and it was interesting to see the dramatization of how Ted Bundy basically, through his own arrogance, made his own legal case worse for himself in spite of his own legal defense. He was so in desperate need for control that it ended up hurting his defense. But I like this film because it goes over the relationship and the social situations that Ted Bundy was in. It doesn't really spend much time glorifying the murders or really go into any specific gruesome detail like that, like a lot of true crime might. So I think the film serves a good purpose to show not only was this charismatic person, radiant, but also seemed bright, but just underneath, it's kind of difficult to tell just at a first glance who someone is, and especially when you become emotionally involved with that person and they try to lie to you and they gaslight you about who they are and they try to make you feel guilty and like you're dependent on them. So I think it's a good film. Definitely check it out. But the real reason why I chose to the subject of Ted Bundy was because I rented No Man of God, which is about the behavioral science unit of the FBI conducting interviews with Ted Bundy, trying to get confessions out of him about all of these unsolved murders. And it's a really good film, especially since it is in the true crime genre, but like the previously mentioned film, it doesn't glorify the violence or the character of Ted Bundy, and I think there's a big issue in glorifying serial murderers, especially when they confess to over 30 murders across the United States from the Pacific Northwest around the 1970s to the Midwest in Utah and Colorado in the 1974 to 1975, and finally being caught after going on a rampage in a final spree in 1978 in Florida. And each one was particularly gruesome. He beheaded half of his victims, it seems, and he would use his charm to lure people in and manipulate them and then eventually take their lives. So if the previous film was about seeing the trial and seeing Bundy's emotional relationships that he has with people and that manipulation, but in here, we get to see Bundy kind of backed into a corner, but everyone kind of wants to get information out of him. So he's still playing the role of where he wants to be as a manipulator, but he still likes to talk shop about what he would consider his vocation, what he would spend his entire time driving around the country trying to do. So I think it's important, at least I like the end of this film because it kind of goes through all of the details in his confession in a disorienting way, and we as an audience are just kind of left there a little bit fatigued. And then Bill Hagmaier, the FBI agent, he kind of asked him, well, Bundy asked him, why do you think I did all of this? And then Hagmaier just basically says, because you wanted to. And I think that's important because Bundy never wanted to be diagnosed. Uh, he never wanted to be called insane. He wanted to be seen as someone completely rational in all the things that he did. So, the first legal test for not guilty by reason of insanity is the McNaughton rule, and it originates from 1843 with Daniel McNaughton, who shot the secretary to the prime minister, who, thinking it was the prime minister himself, because he wanted to have some retribution over what he thought was he was being targeted by the prime minister himself. And so it was ruled in his case that no reasonable verdict could be punishing someone who is not reasonable themselves and who cannot distinguish between the ethics of their actions and what is right and what is wrong. And they can't really know the nature of their act because their act is not really based in reality in this case. So for the Bundy behavior, that's the metric we're going on for this side. Ted Bundy never admits his crimes until the very end when he confesses. He always plays the victim card. He has a strong self-concept, you could say, and the thing is, he knowingly avoids cops and he tries to hide in plain sight, and he never goes to the police. He never wants to admit that he does something wrong. He wants to basically do what he wants and not have to face the legal consequences for it. So whether or not you could say that he knows it's wrong to commit murder because he knows the legal consequences could be different from saying that he knows what's morally wrong. But I think it's safe to say that since Ted Bundy is an amoral character, that he may not necessarily know how to distinguish what is actually wrong in that case. With the irresistible rule, it is in accordance with the McNaughton ruling that basically the first case for this was in Alabama in 1887, but it demonstrated that mental distress or that the mental status of a person caused the loss of executive functioning for their action in committing a crime to be an impulsive action itself. So what might an irresistible innocent impulse mean? It could mean that a person could knowingly commit a crime that they know was wrong, but they have no other recourse but to act on those impulses. And this could go into a whole debate about free will and how, much of a factor that is, or how reflective a person can be in the moment, or how we can judge whether or not something was completely impulsive at the time, retrospectively. But Ted Bundy could have convinced himself that he was in the right, and that everyone else was wrong about judging him for the actions that he commits. He does not need to know what is wrong in this case, but he would blame everyone else before himself for the responsibility of his actions before he took responsibility for his actions, even though he would like to take total control of the life of other people. So for this, the mental disorder causes inhibition of inhibitions, and that could be inhibition of social inhibition, in that Bundy has no issue with luring women away to have them be used for his own ends. So when it comes to impulsive actions and obeying the law or not obeying the law, it makes it hard to distinguish between what's completely uncontrollable action from what an out of control individual is doing. So for Bundy, he has a lot of impulses, especially when it comes to sexual violent behavior, and the way that he objectifies women, and the way that he basically just doesn't see them as anything but his own personal mean. So while Bundy did not kill compulsively for his own hedonic value, he did kill for his own hedonic value. He would not corroborate with any expert diagnosis for a disorder, and he knew his actions were legally wrong, just that the law, he probably didn't think that the law applied to him and that he could have avoided it. It's also important to note, too, that in his life, when he went on one of his big murder sprees, was right after he didn't commit to a marriage that he said he was going to commit to. So that kind of loss of a relationship could have done something for him to validate or to continue down a path of brutalizing other people. And once he escaped his incarceration and he went to Florida, he couldn't get a job, and he resorted back to stealing, and then that escalated into the behavior eventually on one night when he attempted 5 murders in the first degree in the span of about a half hour, and he killed 2 young women because of that. So that doesn't show a lot of control over his situation. All right, the Durham Rule was a ruling from 1954, and what is unique about this ruling is that it is allowed for a psychiatric testimony. So like a mental health expert is able to provide the reason for why someone has a mental diagnosis, a mental disorder, and that is reason enough for the not guilty by reason of insanity. The requirements, you don't have to understand the ethics of the consequences of your actions or about the legality of your actions. It's purely about the mental status of an individual. So Bundy, he doesn't abide the law. He does understand the ramifications, but it doesn't really matter here. He doesn't want to be noticed by others, and he thinks that he could hide among others in his own disguises. But he does have antisocial personality tendencies, especially when it comes to murder, and sexual violence. But in the film, we don't see any expert psychiatric testimony, and to the extent that they would know to look for this, I don't know. It probably was kind of early, in the 70s. So I don't think it would have been on the onus of the defendant to prove their insanity at the time, and proving his insanity is not what Ted Bundy wanted in the first place. All right, so the American Law Institute, or the Ali Rule, this was composed in 1962 after a bunch of lawyers and judges begrudgingly got together and they wanted to redefine the legal term of insanity in a better, more integrated way, since we had all these previous insanity rulings. And it was widely accepted up until 1982, and it slowly phased out after that with preceding rulings. But the key point is that it integrated previous definitions of the insanity rules, and the requirements are that criminal actions result from a mental disorder or mental distress, or that the mental state of a person demonstrates a lack of complete knowledge of the ethical consequences of their actions, or their mental status results in a failure to abide by the law, or a incapability to conform to the law itself. In this case, one of their requirements is also including aspects of the Durham Rule, in that psychiatric or a mental health witness or testimony is important in evaluating the status of an individual here, but it differs in that the mental status or diagnosis is not enough for a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. So what's Bundy's behavior? He kind of shows remorse at the very end, when he has to tell Liz, his girlfriend, what happened to the head of one of his victims, but it's more that he's embarrassed for himself and that he has no one else to really talk to or care about. And really it's that he's lost all of his control over Liz too, and that she will never enter in his life again. Bundy did have a understanding of the law itself, but he did not abide by the law, and it could be fairly easy to say that because it was in his habits to not apply the law to himself. I mean, he wanted to be an authority figure of the law, sure, but at the same time, at each point that he had a chance to break the law, he would do it for his own personal gain, and he would not see a problem in lying about why he did that as well. And he seems to have the capability to say what might be perceived as right or wrong, but you could argue that since he doesn't actually act in accordance with that, it shows that he does have a lack of understanding of ethical consequences himself. And so since we can't discern whether or not he had a medical diagnosis or a mental diagnosis, he may not qualify for the not guilty by reason of insanity. And another thing is that he does have a history of anti-social behavior, but that can't be used against him, really, in this case, because according to the Alley Rule, it says the term mental disease or defect does not include an abnormality manifested only by repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct. All right, and now we get to the Insanity Defense Reform Act. The history goes that this was enacted in 1984 after John Hinckley shot the president and his chief staff member, and he had a history of schizophrenia, and he wanted to commit this crime to prove his love and devotion to actress Jodie Foster. He also had other issues with conforming and socializing, but the verdict for his case was not guilty by reason of insanity, so a lot of people took issue with this, and it was so that we got another ruling and new definitions of insanity and how it actually works within our legal system. So in this case, mental disorders no longer absolve anyone from the responsibility to abide by the law, like in the Ali rule. Someone with a severe cognitive disorder or mental disorder, intense distress, could receive not guilty by reason of insanity because they had this complete lack, or a partial lack of awareness about how to obey the law or abide by the law, or about what they did was wrong. However, this new rule does maintain the McNaughton rule of lack of understanding the wrongfulness of an act, and the consequences of that act as well. So what are the requirements? By the nature of a mental disorder or impaired mental acuity, those unable to discern wrongfulness in their action at the time of their action can be found not guilty by reason of insanity. So the burden of proof is now on the defendant to show insanity, that they were going under insanity at the time of the crime committed. So what's the Bundy behavior? Bundy lies to avoid punishment, and any admittance of a guilty verdict. At one point, his mom shows up to court, and he's about to plead guilty, and then he says, "Why would you do this? I can't do this. I'm just going to fight this until the very bitter end." Bundy didn't really have any impaired mental acuity. He tried to be a scholar, depending on whatever you think that means in his case, when he has limited access to that kind of thing behind the cell. But one of the issues is that since he tried to take control of his case himself, he had no legal recourse to kind of bring in expert opinions that could prove his insanity, because this was the very last thing that he wanted. And if he did that, he would still be serving time today. So the verdict for this is that he does not qualify for not guilty by reason of insanity. And there's that. All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care.